The Marian reforms of 107 BC were a group of military reforms initiated by Gaius Marius, a statesman and general of the Roman Republic. Roman army before the Marian reforms. Up until the last decade of the 2nd century BC, the eligibility requirements to become a Roman soldier in the service of the Republic were very strict. He had to be a member of the 5th census class or higher. He had to own property worth 3,500 sesterces in value. He had to supply his own armaments. In particular, it produced a division among Roman census classes, in which 4 standardized unit types comprised each legion: velites, the poorest and often the youngest citizens, who could not afford a gladius, a shield, a helmet or armor. They were unarmored javelin-throwing skirmishers, who ran forward at the head of the Roman line of battle, expended their missiles to distract the enemy while the hastata advanced, and then quickly retreated through the lines to the rear. They were not expected or equipped to hold any portion of the battle line. Hastata 4th-class citizens who could afford basic armor, a small shield and a gladius. The first rank of heavy infantry in the Premarion legion. The hastata were expected to hold the front of the line in the center of the battle and were usually young and aggressive men of middle to lower middle class. Due to their lesser armor and position in the front ranks, they inevitably took the highest casualties in any battle. But good performance meant promotion to the Principes and upward social mobility in peace. Principes 3rd-class citizens, who could afford a full set of high-quality armor, a large shield and a bronze helmet in addition to their sword, considered the core of the Premarion legion. The Principes were the Premarion unit that most closely resembled the standardized legionary that the Marian reforms would eventually produce. They stood directly behind the hastata and relieved them in the front line if they were unable to break the enemy formation by themselves, which was common, allowing the enemy to wear themselves out on the lighter hastata before facing the Principes usually proved to be a decisively successful strategy. Triarii, the final infantry unit, the Triarii, was restricted to experienced veterans of the Principes, and anchored the entire Roman battle line, fighting in the manner of the hoplites at the rear of the formation. The Triarii were considered the elite infantry of the Premarion legion and were not usually needed, but were used as a last resort if the hastata and Principes could not break the enemy line and were forced to retreat. The Roman idiom ad triarios reducer was used to refer to a final, mighty attempt to salvage a desperate situation. Equites, rich citizens of the equestrian order who could afford a horse. The equites were light cavalry who carried a one-handed light spear. They usually advanced along the flanks of the infantry line, and were intended to break up enemy skirmisher and missile units and pursue forces that had been routed by the infantry. They were also the legion's primary reconnaissance force. When war threatened, the consuls of the day would be charged with the duty of recruiting an army from the eligible citizenry of the Republic. As a rule, one of the consuls would lead this mainly volunteer army into battle. As can be imagined, not all elected consuls were adept at leading an army. For example, in the year 113 BC the consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo was defeated at the Battle of Norea by invading tribes of the Cimbri and the Teutons. This disaster was followed by a protracted war in Africa against King Jugurtha of Numidia. The consul Quintus Caius Aelius Metellus Numidicus was sent to defeat Jugurtha. Metellus never lost any armies and did win some battles, but after 2 years had not achieved total victory. Gaius Marius, one of his legates, requested Metellus to release him from his duties so he could return to Rome and run for consul at the end of 108 BC. But when Marius became junior consul in 107 BC and was appointed the task of concluding the war with Jugurtha, he had no army. The army Metellus had commanded in Africa was assigned to the senior consul Lucius Cassius Longinus to expel the Cimbri, who were once again encroaching on the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul. Marius had no troops with which to conduct the war in Africa, as the eligible citizenry from whom he could recruit an army was severely depleted due to previous military disasters and the expansion of the latifunda at the expense of small landowners. To overcome this problem, he introduced a number of reforms. Marian reforms. The foremost of the Marian reforms was the inclusion of the Roman landless masses, the capita censi, men who had no property to be assessed in the census. Instead they were counted by the head. These men were now among the ranks of those who could be recruited even though they owned no significant property. Because these poor citizens could not afford to purchase their own weapons and armor, Marius arranged for the state to supply them with arms. He thus offered the disenfranchised masses permanent employment for pay as professional soldiers, and the opportunity to gain spoils on campaign. With little hope of gaining status in other ways, the masses flocked to join Marius in his new army. These professional soldiers were recruited for an enlistment term of 16 years, later to rise to 20 years full service and 5 years as a vocator under the reforms of Augustus. The second important reform implemented by Marius was the formation of a standing army. Marius was able to standardize training and equipment throughout the Roman legions. Drilling and training took place all year round, even in times of peace, not just when war threatened. Marius organized the legions as follows. The total number of men in a full-strength legion was about 6,000, of whom 4,800 were actual soldiers. The rest were classified as non-combatants. The internal organization of a legion consisted of 10 cohorts of 6 centuries each. The century consisted of 100 men, 80 legionaries and 20 non-combatants. However, the first cohort was irregular and consisted of 5 double-strength centuries. Each century was divided again into 10 contubernia led by a decanus. The contubernium contained 8 legionaries and 2 non-combatant servants who tented and messed together. The century fought as a unit, marched as a unit and camped as a unit. The century carried with it all the arms and accoutrements required to feed and maintain it as a fighting unit. Each man was responsible for carrying his own supplies, weapons, and several days' worth of rations. This change drastically reduced the size of the baggage train required as support and made the army much more mobile. Between 2 and 6 legions clubbed together constituted an army. The legions were kept in peak physical condition and discipline by constant training, one of the best in the ancient world. The third reform that Marius was able to introduce was legislation that offered retirement benefits in the form of land grants. Members of the head count who had completed their term of service would be given a pension by their general and a plot of land in the conquered region on which to retire. Officers and commanders were given monetary rewards that were 10 to 25 times greater than that of a common foot soldier. Finally, Marius granted citizens of the Italian allies full Roman citizenship if they fought for Rome and completed a period of service in the Roman army. Impact of Marian reforms. The first, and most obvious result, was the improvement in the military capability of the army. No longer, when war threatened the Republic, did a general have to hastily recruit a citizen army, train it to fight and obey military commands and discipline, then march it off to do battle, raw and unblooded. This fact alone was instrumental in the growth and success of the Roman military machine and resulted in the continued success of the Romans on the battlefield. Another benefit of the reforms was the settlement of retired legionaries in conquered land. This helped to integrate the region into a Roman province and Romanize its citizens, reducing unrest and revolt against Roman rule. However, loyalty of the legions shifted away from the Roman state, i.e., the Senate and people of Rome, and towards the generals who led the army. It became alarmingly common for a general to prolong his imperium by using the army to influence the Senate and consolidate his power. Some even went as far as to declare war on their enemies. This led ultimately to the destruction of the Republic and its transformation into an empire under the rule of an emperor. Subsequent modifications. The cohort legions of the late Republic and early Empire are often called Marian legions. Following the Battle of Vercelli in 101 BC, Marius granted all Italian soldiers Roman citizenship. He justified this action to the Senate by saying in the din of battle he could not distinguish Roman from ally. This effectively eliminated the notion of allied legions. Henceforth all Italian legions would be regarded as Roman legions. Thus the three different types of heavy infantry were replaced by a single, standard type of legionary based on the Principes. The role of allied legions would eventually be taken up by contingents of allied, auxiliary troops, called auxilia. Each legion had a same-size or near-same-size auxilia, which contained specialist units, engineers and pioneers, artillerymen and siege craftsmen, service and support units plus units made up of non-citizens and undesirables. These were usually formed into complete units such as light cavalry, light infantry or velites, and laborers. There was also a reconnaissance squad of 10 or more light mounted infantry called speculatres who could also serve as messengers or even as an early form of military intelligence service. During these reforms, the legions were also organized into permanent cohorts for the first time. Prior to this, cohorts had been temporary administrative units or tactical task forces of several maniples, even more transitory than that of the legions of the early Republic themselves. Now the cohorts were 6 to 10 permanent units, composed of 5 to 8 sentries each led by a centurion assisted by an optio, a soldier who could read and write. These came to form the basic tactical unit of the legions. The senior centurion of the legion was called the primus pilus, a career soldier and advisor to the legate. He was generally 50 years of age or older. There were also additional officers assigned to each legion, an aquilifer, a magnifer, a tesserarius, and a cornicen. The aquilifer was in charge of the legion standard, so there was only one per legion. The imaginifer carried an image of the deified emperor. The tesserarius was in charge of the guard outpost for each century. The cornicen was crucial in the heat of battle, as he blew the formation, attack, withdrawal, and many other notes. This was the only way legionaries and their officers could hear or issue orders in the din of battle. Every legion had a baggage train of 500 to 550 mules, or about 1 mule for every 10 legionaries. To keep these baggage trains from becoming too large, Marius had each man carry as much of his own equipment as he could, including his own armor, weapons and 15 days' rations, or about 50 to 60 pounds of load total. To make this easier, he issued each legionary a forked stick to carry his load on his shoulders. The soldiers were nicknamed Marius mules due to the amount of gear they had to carry themselves. A typical legion of this period had around 5,000–6,000 legionaries, as well as a large number of camp followers, servants and slaves. Legions could contain as many as 6,000 fighting men divided among several cohorts. Numbers would also vary depending on casualties suffered during a campaign. Julius Caesar's legions during his campaign in Gaul often only had around 3,500 men, and on one occasion during his civil war against Pompey the Great, he had to join 2 of his battle-reduced legions together to achieve the strength of one conventional legion. Hundreds of years later, under the Emperor Diocletian and his successors, new legions raised for the field armies. This was a response to the logistical needs of the late empire. The smaller units were more easily dispatched as needed to trouble spots than were the older, larger units, and they were no longer made up exclusively of fully armored heavy infantry. Instead, they often consisted of light infantry or archers. Except with regard to Roman citizenship, they were, in fact, no longer sharply distinguished, if distinguished at all, from auxiliary units raised from barbarians within and without the empire. These later legions should not be confused with the legions of heavy infantry of the earlier empire.